Welcome to the MarkLogic Security video series from MarkLogic University. This video is the fourth part in a series of topics covering key concepts to master when implementing a security model in MarkLogic. In this video, we're going to take a look at configuring and testing both digest and application level authentication for MarkLogic application servers. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need to download and install MarkLogic. As we progress throughout this tutorial, we'll refer to various pieces of code. These examples are available through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. Now keep in mind, this tutorial builds on the prior 3 episodes in this series. So if you're following along at home, you'll want to make sure that you've watched those episodes and completed the associated hands-on work. In this series, we've been accessing our application using a MarkLogic HTTP app server. This app server can be configured to authenticate in several ways. Now, digest is the default, and with digest authentication, you must log in to access the site. The login interface is provided automatically through the browser, and the submitted credentials are encrypted. However, many applications choose to manage authentication themselves within the application. In this situation, a user can come to your site anonymously, which means you must define what that anonymous person can do. And this is done by specifying a default user. The roles assigned to the default user will determine what the anonymous person is able to do on the site prior to logging in. Now, perhaps your site is providing a public service and the data is freely available. In this scenario, the default user might be able to search your database and read information from the database without ever logging in and using their own credentials. Or perhaps your site requires more control over what users can do. In this scenario, maybe the default user only has rights to access the login portion of the site, so that they must log in with their credentials and create a session that's unique to them. And we should also note when we're discussing authentication that MarkLogic can be configured so that users are authenticated using an external authentication protocol, such as LDAP or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or Kerberos. We'll be covering external authentication in more detail in a future episode in this series. And on another note, please remember that you can also configure SSL on your MarkLogic application server. For more information, please see the administrator's guide in the documentation, and you can also view the related MLU on-demand tutorial covering how to set up SSL. Simply search the on-demand site or mobile app for SSL. Now let's take a look at digest and application level authentication in action. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at how a default HTTP application server behaves. And if you recall, in episode 3, we set up a really simple application on top of our database where we loaded some documents and we experimented with document permissions. So if I open a browser and navigate out to that application server and run my app, we'll see the default in action. Now this is digest authentication. And remember, with digest authentication, it's the browser that's delivering you this authentication dialog box. And so we could log in using our bond user, and we would see that the application delivers to us the appropriate documents that bond is able to read, which are related to the secret role and the documents that have given the secret role a read permission. We can close this session by exiting our browser. Now if I launch another browser and go back out to the app, and this time I log in using our M user, we would then see the documents that M is able to read based on her roles, which include both secret and top secret documents. So that's digest authentication, browser-based. But let's say that we wish to implement application level authentication, which means we would like our app to handle the login interface and creating the session and authenticating the user. So in that scenario, we need to make a change to our default application server configuration. So we could open up a browser and we could make that change by going out to the admin interface on port 8001. And if we log into the admin interface and take a look at our app server on port 8010, we would see where this can be configured. And if we scroll down, we will see the authentication setting, which is currently set to digest, and we will see the default user setting, which we're going to need to take into account as soon as we change this to be application level. So remember, anything that you could do through this admin interface could also be accomplished using the admin API or the management REST API. So we see how we could do it manually. Let's now take a look at how we could do this through the management REST API. So let's open up Query Console and let's import the workspace for this episode. So if you just go out to Query Console, you can select Import Workspace and navigate out to wherever on the file system you have placed these episode files, which remember you can access through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. And let's navigate into the episode 4 folder and select security episode 4.xml and import it. And this one is really simple. We've only got one tab, and this is going to use the management REST API to change that configuration of our app server. So let's study this for a moment. We see that we're defining the configuration variable, and we're defining this JSON to set a property called authentication. We're going to change that to application level. And then remember, anytime you're setting application level authentication, you need to set the default user. If you recall the different users and roles that we created back in episode 3, we specifically built a role and a user for this purpose. So we're going to use it now. We're going to set our default user equal to that project default user that we created. Now the way we're going to implement this is through the management REST API, and we're going to reference our application server by its name, and that is, if you recall, security-demo, and then we're going to manipulate its properties through the properties endpoint, and we're going to simply pass it in our options, which contains that configuration data that we specified. So we can run this, which will then make the change, and when it finishes we see that we get back a success response. And of course, if we wanted to, we could go out and refresh the admin interface, and we would see now that authentication is set to application level and our default user has been set as well. So let's see what this does then when we start a new session and go to our application. So let's open up another browser and let's go out back to our app, and we see that we get a document back, and based on our user that is now the default user, when we come to this site for the first time, we did not have to authenticate. We are being treated as the default user. And if you recall the setup of our default user, they have been given that role called project default, and that role has read rights on unclassified documents. And that's what we see here is our unclassified document. And so there we've seen it. HTTP app servers by default have digest configuration. We can change that to application level, which means we then need to think about the default user. Now in a real application, what we would probably choose to do is create a login interface, which you could then create a session and authenticate a user on your own in the app through that interface. And we have functions within our various APIs to enable you to do that. Now that we've taken a look at digest and application level authentication in action, let's take a moment to review some key takeaways. First, remember that MarkLogic HTTP app servers can be configured for SSL, and we also support external authentication via LDAP or Kerberos. Next, you can build authentication into your app by choosing the application level authentication option, which we showed you in the demo. And then if you choose that option, remember that you do need to set up that default user, which will dictate what a person can do when they come to your site for the very first time and they have yet to authenticate through your app. In this episode, we've taken a look at authentication options for the HTTP application server in MarkLogic and taken a look at digest authentication and application level authentication. As a next step, make sure you go out and get MarkLogic from our developer community, and you can follow along with the examples in this episode by going out to the MarkLogic University GitHub site. Please remember that you can also get additional training and hands-on exercises in these topics. To learn more, please go out to marklogic.com/training, and you can also watch additional on-demand tutorials through the on-demand website or the MarkLogic University mobile app. And lastly, please remember to add MarkLogic as a skill on your LinkedIn profile.